But without further ado, I want to get into our teaching for today, which is going to be about leaders and followers. Leader burnout and dropout rates are high. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to know this. Many of us have experienced this either firsthand or we've seen a leader in our life say, peace out, I can't do this anymore. A few statistics. Microsoft conducted a global survey of workers in 2022 and found that 53% of managers reported feeling burned out at work. Similarly, Harvard Business Review found that 82% of executives struggle with feelings of burnout. In 2021 alone, nearly 2 in 5 pastors considered quitting full-time ministry. And these feelings of burnout are not just fueled by modern-day leadership demands, but also by the waning distrust of leadership in our culture today. In 2021, Gallup found that only 21% of U.S. employees trust the leadership of their organizations. Ouch. Similarly, Pew Research found that most people express a lack of distrust in federal government, and only 57% of all U.S. adults agree that a pastor is a trustworthy source of wisdom. Barna summed up these sentiments well when surveying 18 to 35-year-olds in 2019 and finding that 82% of young adults believe society is facing a quote-unquote crisis of leadership because there aren't enough good leaders right now. The simple reality is over the last 20 years, we have developed a strong distrust for anyone in authority and an even stronger avoidance of being in authority. And honestly, I get it. I've been in spaces where it's been really hard to follow, and I've also been in spaces where it's been really hard to lead. I bet many of you can relate to this as well. Unfortunately, though, maybe understandably, but unfortunately, the response to a conundrum like this is often just disengagement. If my boss is a jerk, why care about my job? If my employees disrespect me, why lead at all? If I can't trust political leaders, why participate? If I can't trust a pastor or spiritual leader, why go to church or even follow Jesus? Whether we realize it or not, this leadership crisis is something that affects us all. And while it might be tempting to disengage, eject, or throw in the towel, Peter and Jesus, for that matter, give us another way. And so if you would turn to 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 1. You can do so following along using that QR code and the seat back in front of you. You can just hit today's liturgy. The scripture will be there. You can use a physical Bible. You can pull up your Bible app, whatever fits your fancy. And as you're turning there, I actually want to just give a little bit of context on 1 Peter. So we're concluding our teaching series on 1 Peter this week. We've been going through the book for the last couple of months now as we've been examining Peter's writings to the persecuted churches of modern-day Asia Minor. And as we've learned, these churches have been facing hostility and harassment, persecution, even to the point of death by their Greek and Roman neighbors. And so Peter writes to them to encourage them that although they may be suffering, there is great hope that can be found in Jesus' resurrection. At the very end of this letter, these verses that were just read, Peter works to address three different groups. The first one being leaders, second, followers, and the last one, all, or y'all, as us Midwesterners would say. And it's actually not rocket science to understand why Peter would write on this matter. Jeanette Oak puts it this way: intra-church solidarity amid persecution depends on Christ-like shepherding of the flock. That was a lot of big words, so I'm going to say that again. Intra-church solidarity and mid-persecution depends on Christ-like shepherding of the flock. Or in other words, a persecuted church cannot survive if it attacks itself. If leaders treat people poorly and people treat leaders poorly. Any of this sounding familiar? Even though as modern Westerners, we cannot relate to the type of persecution that Peter's original audience would have been experiencing, I think there's a lot that we can still learn from Peter's comments on power dynamics. And so here's the plan for today. We're going to focus on those three groups that Peter discusses in verses 1 through 8. To be clear, verses 9 through 14 are still really great. They're very important. That's why we read them. They're worth studying. But these verses act more as summary thoughts to the whole of Peter's letter and deal with a lot of the themes that we've already discussed. And so I want to focus on the new concepts presented in our passage today that we find in verses 1 through 8. So let's dive in. Peter addresses leaders, and he says this. So I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you. Not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. So a few things to begin as we talk about leaders. First of all, Peter is talking specifically about pastoral leadership here. That is clear from the context of our passage. However, I do think these principles can be applied indirectly to all kinds of leadership. For Peter clearly makes an argument that we are to lead as Jesus did. And last I checked, each and every one of us is supposed to mimic Jesus to the world around us, wherever we may find ourselves. Furthermore, an argument could be made that we all have some form of leadership. John Maxwell defines leadership in this way, saying leadership is influence. Leadership is influence. So whether you are a parent influencing your kids, an employee influencing your other coworkers, or a friend influencing your group of friends, you are a leader in some respect. Leadership should not be limited to titles, positions, or hierarchies. So in summary, Peter's instructions can apply to us all as we all exert some kind of influence. Second, Peter is qualified to advise us in this way because he himself is a leader, or a fellow elder as he calls himself. He knows the temptations, the joys, the difficulties, the challenges, and the blessings of leadership. He has had moments of failure and moments of success, and he knows the complexities of community life. In fact, the shepherding metaphor that he uses in verse 2 should bring to mind Jesus' instructions to Peter in John chapter 21. Jesus says to Peter, "Feed my sheep." And keep in mind, this has occurred right after Peter has denied Jesus and massively failed to lead well during Jesus' greatest hour of suffering and need. And this brings up a really good point. Peter is calling leaders and elders here not to be perfect, but to do their best to emulate Jesus. And when inevitably they do mess up and fail, their job is to apologize, to pick back up the task of shepherding, and to keep on going. That's the story of Peter, the story of the early church, and I think our story even today. Specifically, Peter gives some instructions saying, lead willingly, not begrudgingly. Lead to serve, not for monetary or status gain. And finally, lead by example, not through domination. Or a good way to summarize this, seek to serve others through the example of Jesus. That is leadership. And oh my, is this radically different from the ethics of our world. As Scott McKnight puts it, power no more today than in the first century is addictive. It leads to unworthy motives and pollutes decisions that are to be made under the guidance of the Spirit. Instead of seeking God's agenda, power-hungry leaders pursue their own. But as Jesus followers, I think we're called to something different, something more. And although we may be tempted to divorce our work, civic, community, or even home life from our spiritual life, this is not what Jesus asks us to do. Instead, he calls all of us, bosses, community leaders, political officers, parents, ministry leaders, to be eager to serve, to wash the feet of those we lead, and to care more about people than what those people do for us. And here is the crazy thing. In this kind of upside-down world of leadership, Jesus' kingdom ethic truly shines. Let me give you an example. Arthur Brooks has done a ton of research with Oxford and Harvard, and they've actually found that the happier the employee is, the better the company's bottom line. Anybody that is an employee could figure this out. But many who are employers have not, right? But how cool is it? How beautiful and wonderful is it that serving others well actually shows that we can have greater productivity and profits? This is what it is like to see Jesus' kingdom ethic at work. So here is my question for you today. As a leader, wherever you may find yourself, do you seek to serve others through the example of Jesus? And if not, what do you need to change to lead like Jesus wherever you are? The second group that Peter addresses are followers. Picking back up in verse 5, Peter writes this: "Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders." The word younger here is actually a really difficult one to translate, primarily because there's likely some situational context that both Peter and the original audience are aware of here. And so everybody knows who the younger ones are, except for us 2,000 years later that don't have this situational context. So a few ideas as to who these younger ones could be. It could literally be referring to age, as culturally, age and status were deeply intertwined in the ancient world. It could also be referring to spiritual maturity, those who are newer to their faith than the elders. Or it could even be referring to elders to be, or like apprentices, those that are on deck. Regardless of the specifics of this group, though, Peter is instructing them, whoever they may be, to submit, to listen to the wisdom of the elders, and to live in accordance with their instructions. That's why I've given this group the title followers. To be clear, Peter is not suggesting that these younger ones submit blindly to authority or follow no questions asked. But he is suggesting that if a leader is doing their best to be like Jesus, they're doing the things that he has outlined above, if there is healthiness at the top, then people should follow their lead. And let's face it, in a world of independence, entrepreneurs, and free thinkers, this is just not a popular idea. Theologian Scott McKnight, again, he puts it this way: "This puts a finger on a touchy issue: leadership and authority. Ours is not a culture that easily adjusts itself to such an idea. Ours, in fact, is a society of mavericks and do-it-yourselfers. Consequently, not only does the term submission sound foreign, but even the idea of actually being led is hard for many to comprehend." Although the pendulum swing away from authority and leadership does have some cultural positives, I do think there are also a lot of negatives. Just as it is healthy for a child to follow the guidance of a parent and to learn from them, it is also healthy for many of us to continue learning from those who are wiser and or more experienced than we are. A quick example, as younger leaders in our 30s, Alex and I at every single turn have confronted our limitations and weaknesses as leaders. And we have found the need to submit over and over and over again to those that are literally older than us and those that are wiser and more experienced than us. This is why we have a board of directors at our church, overseers and mentors who have years on us, some of us even twice our age. Submission, as unpopular as it may be, does lead time and time again to humility, teachability, and growth. And submission ultimately is the first step in becoming a Jesus-like leader. For to lead as Jesus did is to become a servant to all. The cliche phrase still rings true today: to lead, you must learn to follow. So for those who are in leadership positions, it is healthy and, dare I even say, necessary to be in positions where you are following. It helps you to remember what it's like, and it helps you to have empathy and compassion for those for whom you lead. After all, we are all serving a chief shepherd named Jesus, as Peter puts it in verse 4. To be a Jesus follower is to embody submission in every single aspect of our life. And so here would be the challenge today: wherever you find yourself, how can you follow? How can you submit to those older and wiser and maybe more experienced than you and learn from them? And finally, the third group that Peter addresses is all, or all of y'all, or all of ya, right? As Alex's Arkansas relatives would say, all of ya over there. Yeah, those people. Picking up in verse 5b, Peter writes this: clothe yourselves, all of you, this is where we get the y'all, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. When you are leading, it is easy to be fixated on how followers have wounded you. And when you are following, it is easy to get fixated on how leaders have hurt you. And so Peter puts everybody on the same team, and he advises them saying, be humble, cast your anxieties on Jesus, and remember who the true enemy is. First, when both leaders and followers clothe themselves in humility, everyone is concerned with serving one another. And interestingly enough, problems of leadership and submission are virtually gone when this is our primary concern. Second, when inevitably leadership troubles arise, when we feel the effects of leadership crisis bearing down on us, we have a friend, a brother in Jesus who is willing to bear them, to take on all our anxieties. And finally, when conflict arises, our frustrations can be appropriately channeled when we remember the real enemy. This last instruction is the one that I want to spend the most time on today. If we were to put our literary English hats on, verse 8 feels like it comes straight out of nowhere. Like we get this beautiful, loving reminder that Jesus is there for us when we're anxious, that we can cast all our cares on him. And then Peter says, watch out, pay attention, wake up. Why? Because the enemy prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. And although this may feel misplaced or off topic, Peter knows exactly what he is doing here. He is warning against the enemy's efforts to sow interpersonal conflict in a community or a community of faith. This is why that lion metaphor that he uses is so appropriate. If you've ever watched the Discovery Channel, which I know you have, you know, right, the lion follows the prey. He waits in the bushes until one decides to wander off, and then he pounces. The lion, or the enemy's most effective marketing campaign, is making us believe he's not there. To stay hidden long enough behind the brush to make us think he's not there. His most effective strategy is picking us off one by one, separating us from the pack, sowing seeds of power, greed, pridefulness, domination, and rebellion among us, isolating us, and then deflecting the blame onto other people. And so Peter says, remember your real enemy. Remember the spiritual forces lurking behind the scenes that influence leaders and followers alike. Remember the originator of the father of lies, the one who seeks your destruction. And in doing so, we can appropriately channel our frustrations. This is not to say we let people off the hook or we permit excuses like the devil made me do it, but rather that we have compassion for those who have been devoured by the lion. Rather that we wage war against the spiritual war that is that is happening. That we take up weapons like prayer, compassion, love, service, and we discard things like hate, anger, mean-spirited comments, gossip, authoritarian rule, or inappropriate rebellion. This means we respond with gentle correction and compassion instead of anger and a heavy hand to that employee who's messed up again. This means we respond with joy instead of jealousy when a mentee becomes more successful than us. This means we respond with a heart of service instead of resentment when we aren't recognized for our work. This means we respond with undeserved love when a leader treats us unfairly. And this means that we respond with humility, one that learns from others even when we think we know better. Peter says, all of you, followers and leaders alike, remember who your true enemy is. Worship team, if you would join me. As we head into our application for today, my question is pretty simple, and it's this: where are you being challenged? To my leaders in the room, are you willing to be a servant? To followers, are you willing to submit to others? And to all of you, are you willing to remember your true enemy and let that change your response? In a world where good leaders are rare and many are unwilling to follow, in a world where having compassion for even the most difficult and the deplorable is rare, what would it look like to lead, follow, and live like this?